Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne, and today I have Jean Sheridan with me. Jean is a certified professional life and well-being coach who started on this path back in the early 80s, way before it was a thing. She loves learning and has an MS degree in health promotion from Syracuse University and a BS in Interdisciplinary Holistic Health from the State University of New York, and way too many training certificates to mention. We're not going to list them all. She's created programs and presented workshops for universities, health departments, and large corporations such as JP Morgan Chase. Jean is curious and creative by nature and loves coaching and consulting on the topics of well-being. Jean, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Marianne. It's my pleasure to be here.
As you know, from when we met and did a connection call, I'm trying to build this series around rest and play, fun, whatever terms you want to put to it. And I know that when we met, you told me your backstory and a little bit about how you came to this point in your life where that sort of bubbled up for you. And you talked to me about feeling overwhelmed, super anxious, just done. And yet you also felt you were sort of missing something. There was this like meh in your life, and you went to see a therapist.
I had started a new job, and 6 months after I'd started the new job, my aunt had a massive heart attack. And I was the only family nearby. And so that led to a 12-year period of me caring for her and working full time. And, in the beginning, it was a brand new job. I was still learning it. A couple years in, all of the tools I had, yoga, meditation, all of those tools that I had learned within the wellness world, nothing was working. I went to a therapist. I'm like, I was burned out. And she kept pushing me to take a dance class. And that's just not my thing. It's just not my thing. And so I would fight her every step of the way. And then finally I said, just to sort of appease her, because she wasn't going to let it go, I picked up a brochure from the local performing arts center. And I was just, going through it like, oh, maybe there's something here that I can find. And I hit this page on a comedy improv class. And it was like this 5-year-old child deep within my abdomen burst forth. I mean, it was this incredible energy of just, can we do that? Can we do that? And it was such a strong sensation that I was not familiar with, that was like, I don't know what this is, but I really need to pay attention. So I signed up for my first class, not knowing what I was going to get into, had a blast, lots of laughing, scared, a lot of fear. Each week I would go and I would think, I would get really scared, and I would go and I would have so much fun. And so then that led to me I took a couple more improv classes, and then I decided to take an acting class because so many of the people who were taking improv were also acting locally or even in movies. So I took an acting class, and then I took a second acting class, and I was looking in the mirror one day and I went, well, who can I play? Legitimately, who can I play? I could play Mrs. Claus. And the next day I ran into my very first improv teacher and, what's going on, that typical. So I said to her, it just dawned on me that I'd be a really good Mrs. Claus. She said, I have a very dear friend who's the production person at Busch Gardens in the Tampa Bay area. She said, let me give her a call. Long story short, they said, no, we've got enough Mrs. Clauses, but tell her to come in anyway and audition. Come in with the elves and audition with the elves. And I went in, they hired me on the spot. And so for 2 years, I got to play Mrs. Claus at this huge entertainment complex. And can I tell you, it was those 2 years, those were the two most wonderful Christmases I've ever had. And for me, it was about Mrs. Claus is about unconditional love and safe hugs. And so as Mrs. Claus, I'm able to hug everybody. And it was so amazing because people, kids, let's say mostly, grown boys, 14, 15, 17-year-old boys, and they've got an attitude and they don't really want to be there. And they're kind of annoyed with life and and they would come up. I would say, would you like a hug from Mrs. Claus? And they would just melt in my arms. They would just melt and I would just hold them. And I would think, there's nothing more wonderful than this. It was an absolutely incredible experience. So much so that I've gotten my own costume, and not through the pandemic, but I have done not-for-profit kinds of things or church events. I pick and choose.
What I loved about that story, well, a few things, but I really loved how you mentioned that you were resistant at first as well. And, it was the no, 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 no. And then finally you went and you got the brochure and you actually signed up for something that you didn't really have an immediate connection to. You just picked something basically to kind of shut her up, if you will. But what that led to was this series of doors opening and different components of bringing fun into your life, which of course is the topic at hand. And I found that to be fascinating and really important and revealing for people, insightful, because being open to it is the first step, right?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because as I was getting to know all the people in the acting world, and a couple of people kept saying, you really need to get an agent. You really need to get an agent. And again, my resistance, because I'm not an actor and blah, blah, blah. And a couple of serendipity things happened and I ended up getting an agent. So I got to do a ton of infomercials. I was in a professional play, just so much fun. And as I was going through sort of another transition where I lost my full-time job, all of that creative stuff and that acting really filled me up, right? Filled me up as I was trying to sort of figure out the next step, because I had lost my full-time, the company went bankrupt. And, that can throw us off our game for a while.
And so what advice do you have for people that haven't found their thing yet, who are still in resistance?
The first thing I would say is go back and look at when you were a child, 5 years old, middle school, high school, any of that time. What did you enjoy doing? What did you spend your time? I was in the theater in junior high and high school. I did theater a lot, but I never considered it something that I could go back to as a hobby or something as fun. I just always poo-pooed that. So I think that's the key. If there are people who say, well, I wasn't, I was studious, I didn't have anything. Okay, then pick up brochures, look at bulletin boards or online in Facebook, and just see what you might be interested in learning more about. And then the key is act as if you're a first grader. And the reason I say that is that we, as adults, we so often tend to be in this place of, I got to do it right, right? And we don't know how to play. And yes, there are things that we need to do right. If I go to a brain surgeon, I want them to do it right, right? Right. There are certain things that, yes, we need to pay attention. We may need to even be a master at that thing, getting all the education. That's important. But to have a place where you can just play, allow the inner child to come out and just play. And I think that's really key, because we have a tendency, and I'm as guilty of this, well, I've got to turn this into a way to make money. And when I started the improv, it was never intended as a way to make money. It was a byproduct. For me, it's play. It fills me up.
You just hit on something that I hadn't even thought of, but I do think it's a cautionary tale that even when we find these things that we can enjoy and we can call back into our lives for play, we do have to be mindful not to let them then turn into something else, have other people's expectations on them. And, suddenly you find yourself doing the thing, but in a different way, and it's not fun anymore. So I think that's a cautionary tale.
Yes. And that has happened to me now twice. Years ago, I did what I call organic mandalas, where I use micron pens, really fine tip black pens and color pencils. And I draw and doodle is really what it is. And I love them. And I find it really, after my aunt passed away, I did it for a whole month every single day as my meditative practice. And some of them came out, they're kind of cool. And I showed them to somebody, and his immediate thing was, oh, you should turn these into greeting cards and sell them. And my mind went there, and my mind kept going there. My mind kept trying to figure out how to do that. And I lost the joy in doing that completely and totally. And then when the pandemic hit and I couldn't do any of the acting stuff, I really put all my energy into painting. And I got an art coach so I could show her my work each week on Zoom. And then we would talk about like what works, what doesn't work, why does it work, all of that stuff. It was so much fun. At one point, she said to me, talking about a body of work and bringing together a body of work. And anyway, I started submitting my pieces to various art galleries and art shows locally, and they kept getting accepted. So that in a course of about 5 months, I had 12 pieces of art in 7 different shows, which, like, talk about naive. I mean, I'm meeting all these other artists who are wanting to sell their work. Like, it never dawned on me. It wasn't, it was like the fact that my work got accepted into shows. That was the goal. Then I went through a whole year because it was like, well, how do I create it for people to want to buy it? And I got stuck back up in my head again. And I've only just now come back into painting and coming from that playful spirit.
Yeah. So that's definitely a cautionary tale. And you said you went back up in your head again. I keep hearing that sort of sentiment over and over and over, that we have to get out of our heads, get into our body, get into action, get out of our heads.
I think as much as I teach that, and I've learned that through, mindfulness, I really learned it doing improv.
How so?
Because when I talk about improv, I'm not talking about being a stand-up comic, because people who are stand-up comics, they work that stuff out. They're constantly working out and they're delivering it. But improv is a group effort, whether it's one other person or 5 other people on stage together. And so you really have to listen and be present to what the other person is saying so that you're responding to them. Otherwise, if you're up in your head thinking about what you're going to say, you really missed what they're saying. And it's terrible. It's terrible to have to watch. It's terrible because you can't create anything. But if you're really present and you're noticing that they do this, right?
Yeah. She touched her nose, you guys.
Or that whatever it is, then I can respond to that.
Yeah.
Right. But if I'm not paying attention, if I'm up in my head thinking, then I miss the touching of the nose or other things. So it really brought it into practice. I highly recommend improv classes for anyone, as scary as it can be. I think it's kind of personal growth on steroids.
I would imagine that it is, and very vulnerable as well. So yeah. So when you pulled the Band-Aid in and went all in, you went all in.
Well, it didn't feel that way at first because it was once a week for an hour and a half. I think it was 2 hours, which felt like a stretch. But I was really fortunate to get a really, really sweet person as the first teacher. And that makes a huge difference, to get somebody who makes sure that the environment is safe. A lot of times in improv, there's this idea of there's no such thing as failure, which is really beautiful. And in fact, there is something they call it the failure bow. I'm not crazy about that name, but you learn it in the beginning. So if you make a mistake, and I put that in quotes, right? You make a mistake, you take this grand bow, this huge bow. And the bow is really about, I was willing to take a risk. So you're celebrating the risk that you took, not that you missed the mark.
I kind of love that, actually. Yeah. I kind of love that. I mean, that was part of my growing process with all of this, is being able to step in messy and not really having all the answers, but just taking that first step and seeing where it would lead. that is like, I think one of the biggest steps in growth for anyone. And obviously it doesn't have to be this, it could be whatever, but taking that step without having all the answers, without knowing, and
Yes.
being comfortable, being uncomfortable. That's hard.
But you hit on it, learning to be comfortable in that uncomfortable space, right? Being uncomfortable when we're feeling anxious or nervous. Like, oh, that's just part of the process of me being courageous enough to step into this thing, right? And being messy.
That thought brought me back to the whole idea of rest and play and fun, and mostly rest, in that I think for some of us who are very programmed to be very productive, high achievers, people pleasers, whatever, often when we have some quiet time, some downtime, some alone time, we feel the guilt. The guilt creeps in, and then we feel like we should be doing something else. We should, right? We should see your face. You can totally relate to this, right? You should be more productive. So I think part of that whole learning too is understanding that's uncomfortable at first. It's very uncomfortable to allow yourself time to rest, allow yourself time to play. And I think that's an important part of this lesson.
Yeah, I love that. It's uncomfortable to let go, to let our guard down. And that's why I say first grade, right? Because it's kind of messy there.
Yeah.
But to let our guard down and give ourselves that permission to recharge and refuel, rather than constantly being human doings. I got to get this done. I got to get this done. I've got to produce this. I've got to get to this next, whatever this next goal is.
Yeah. So this might be slightly off topic, but maybe not. I know one of the things that you talk about is dealing with stress management in this digital age. Mm-hmm. And when I started thinking about it, I started thinking about how the digital age, I think, has also had an impact on our ability to sort of let ourselves go, let ourselves, slow down, let ourselves have a moment. I feel like it causes us to always be on, if you will. So I'd be interested in what your thoughts are around that, since you do talk around that topic. Do you agree with that?
I agree 100%. 100%. First of all, I love technology. I took a programming class on an Apple II back in the early 80s. I have felt that there's been this sort of walls of technology and well-being that I've sort of walked together. Having said that, we were not prepared for what technology has brought us. And think about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, most people didn't have smartphones. Realtors had car phones. Remember those big car phones, right?
Big antenna.
With the big antenna. Right. That was probably back in the 90s. But yeah. Right, they had, most people did not have any sort of phone. A couple people had Blackberries who were in positions, with corporations. We were just beginning to get computers at home, maybe, but not everybody had them. And then all of a sudden, the floodgates opened up. And everybody's walking around with a smartphone and has at least one computer and maybe two at home. Sometimes you have a personal computer and a work computer, depending. And then the alerts, right? And so it has become this 24/7, because 30 years ago, if I went out for a walk, there was no way for anybody to reach me.
Yeah.
I could go for a walk. My phone was a landline, and yes, we had voice machines back then. So I think we have got to figure out a way to shift back away, so that technology is a tool that we use, but that it's not controlling our lives. And it can even be like, I don't have a problem with social media and YouTube. And I think there's elements that are good. It's not all good and bad, but it's when it takes over and we're mindlessly scrolling because we're looking for something, we're hungry for something, we need and we can't find it there, right? Or we're playing a game on our phone. And I think those are the things that we need to readdress. But I also think corporations have to figure out a way to support their employees, especially companies that are global. when you have people who are working all different hours, there needs to be some sorts of limits put in place so that people don't feel like they have to be on 24/7.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I do think it'll be interesting to watch because I do not think we have a good policy, if you will, around that. And I don't mean government policy. I just mean in general, policy practice, whatever. I don't think there are many that have good practices in play today.
No, I do a fair amount of workshops on stress management, resilience, all that, and burnout. And, these companies are hiring me to come in and talk about burnout. And yes, I want to talk to the individual about how they can spot it, but it also feels like, but it's got to come from top down.
Yeah.
If we've got Slack, and how are we using Slack, which is just another instant messaging platform.
Yeah, there's a lot there for sure.
Yeah.
So let me ask and circle back to our topic that we were focused on and trying to bring play into our lives. And when we look at this demographic of, middle-age-ish women, what do you think surprises you the most, or what does surprise you the most with women who struggle in that area or just in that area in general?
The first thing that comes to mind is that often women don't feel like they have permission. And especially if they're trying to raise a family, they're working full time, the whole management of the home and management of raising the children tend to fall on the women. And okay, I apologize in advance, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think a lot of men don't understand what it means to manage the house and manage the raising of the children. They'll do a chore if you tell them to, right? Just ask me and I'll do it. But they don't comprehend that, right? And so if women are out there trying to do it all, raise children, manage the house, have a professional career, where's the bandwidth to have that thing? And then the wellness movement, I think that there is a lot of in the wellness movement that's not particularly healthy. And so really coming back to not doing something because, like yoga as an example, I think yoga is wonderful, but an hour may be too long for some people. Maybe a 10 or 15 minute stretch is fine. And then there's something else that they really love to do, like salsa dancing or singing, right? Or what is it that lights you up? And then what kind of support do you need from family and friends so that you can spend that time? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think for me, finding the things that light you up can relate to the creativity, can relate to the outlets for fun, can relate to so many things. Exercise, I think about so many people who have struggled, including myself, with around exercise programs. And until you find the things for you, people can give you a list, can tell you what the best practices are, can tell you all the things. But unless it connects with you personally, you're not going to want to do it.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I will tell you. So I live in Florida, and one of the things that I love to do, and I'm sure I look like a crazy nerd, I have these webbed gloves and I have these boots that there's float boots, but they offer resistance. And I get into the pool and I get a really good workout as I not jog because I'm not touching the ground, but it's as if I'm cross-country skiing in the water. I love it. There is something about that cross-country ski action that feels, what's the right word?
Therapeutic.
It feels
restful, comforting.
Comforting. There's something incredible. And maybe it's similar to the bicycle action. There's something about that movement for me that's incredibly comforting. And so finding those things, like you said, and it doesn't matter what it is. And sometimes it requires experimenting. Try this. Nope, not a good fit. Try this until you find that thing.
I think that's important too. And I just talked with somebody else and this keeps coming up as a theme, but probably one that we don't think about often enough is where curiosity fits in. And again, when you go back to your first grader example, they're curious. They ask all the questions. And they don't really care what the answer is. They just ask all the questions. And I think, as I'm thinking more about this, as I'm learning more, that's one of the things I'm going to try to really take in and try to exemplify is putting that hat on of the child and being more curious about it. Because I think that allows us to open new doors. I think it allows us to put the judgment aside.
I love that. I love that. And yet, and the thing about curiosity is reigniting that, because so often as students, we're sort of told that that's bad and wrong. We get a lot of that from our school years. So how do we reignite our sense of curiosity? Do I like this thing or not? And then giving ourselves that permission. Nope, not my thing.
Yeah. Permission to try it, permission to not stick with it, permission just all the way around. Yeah, that's a really great point. I love that. So as we kind of wrap up here, I always like to ask, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would love to leave the audience with?
Baby steps. Baby steps. It doesn't have to be this big thing. It doesn't have to be, an hour. Maybe you don't have an hour.
That's a good one.
But maybe you have 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And sometimes that's enough. I know for me, there have been times when I don't feel like I have the energy to do things. So I say, okay, just for 5 minutes. 90% of the time, I can do something for 5 minutes. It may turn into 20 or 30 minutes, right? Sometimes it doesn't. But it's what is that smallest amount of time to do that thing that brings you joy?
Yeah. Yes. I love that. If we open the door and give ourselves those few minutes, we'll end up extending that and you'll end up getting a little more out of it. So it's an important reframe. Perspective changes lots of things. And I think we often default to, I don't have enough time to exercise today, or, I don't have enough time to meditate today or journal or whatever it is that would be a bigger commitment when, okay, I can do 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That's all. Everybody has 5 minutes.
Or meditating 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Yeah.
It doesn't, any of these things, it doesn't have to be these big chunks, tiny chunks. Yeah.
String them together and there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This was really fun.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it too. I just talking about it, feel energized.
Oh, I love that. Let's hope the listeners do as well. And we'll put all your links in the show notes so people can get in touch with you and find your info and all of that if they want to connect with you. So thanks again.
All right. Sounds good, Marianne. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Message in the Middle with Marianne. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to share it and write a review, as it helps bring new listeners to our audience. If you'd like to keep the conversation going between episodes, please join us at Facebook group Message in the Middle with Marianne.